Well, good morning. Welcome to my studio. I'm about ready to get started on this little piece that I blocked in yesterday. But before I do that, I have to mix all my colors on my palette. And most of you know that typically my palette is a lot in the reds and the oranges and the yellows, but this one is going to be dominantly green. And I also know that green is one of those colors that really give a lot of artists a lot of trouble in terms of how to mix colorful greens and not have it just be a boring green. So today what I'm going to do, I'm going to go into great detail into my palette that I set up for a piece like this where I'm mixing a lot of greens, and I'm going to show you how to make sure that your greens are colorful and not boring. So stick around and we'll get to that. Okay, so my kind of setup when I mix my colors is always the same. I want to have my reference photo sitting out right in front of me so that I can see the colors that I want to be able to mix. And then obviously I have my freshly squeezed colors out. I've got some paper towels here to clean my knife, and I've got some extra paper towels here to wipe my knife off as well. Now, as I've mentioned before, every painting that I do, I'll use a different set of colors. I probably have about 50 different oil colors that I use. And in any given painting, I might use 10, 15, maybe even 20 of those, but it's depending on the colors that I want to mix. I also just have to apologize if you can hear a bit of a background hum. That's the laundry going. Everyone was away last weekend, and the boys were away camping and got soaked. I was away on my golf weekend, and we're all going away this weekend. So the laundry waits for no one. So the washer and dryer is going to be going all day. So let's start with here. I'll start with the colors that I have. Again, I'm not going to get into brand names, but most of these colors are kind of generic. So I have a lemon yellow, I have a cadmium yellow light, I have a cadmium yellow medium, cadmium yellow deep, cadmium orange, and cadmium red. Then we go to a magenta, a dioxazine purple. We've got a phthalo blue. This is an olive green. It's a very, very dark, transparent green. We've got phthalo green blue shade, phthalo green yellow shade. We've got sap green. We've got a cadmium green light, and this is actually called cinnabar green light, but it's again just like a very light green. So these are all the colors that I'm going to use for this painting, except for the birch trees. When I go to the birch trees, I actually will kind of set up a different palette because there's only so much real estate on the palette. I find it's going to take probably the entire palette for me to get the variations of the greens, the yellows, the oranges that are going to go in here. So let me first talk about what I often see people do when they're mixing greens, which is why we have a lot of trouble with greens. So I've taken a phthalo green blue shade and I'm just mixing white with it. And this is kind of one of the worst things you can do, because when you use the same green and you only mix white with it, the only thing you're changing is the value of it, so how light or dark it is, but you're not changing the hue at all, which is in terms of, is it more yellowy, is it more blue, is it more orangey, and then you're also not changing the intensity. The intensity kind of stays the same. So it's all, you're only changing one aspect of it, which is the value. So you don't want to do this. You never want it to be, I know I don't like to say never, but this is the never that I guess pretty close to always. You don't want someone to be able to look at your painting and say, ah, I see you've used Winsor Newton phthalo green blue shade. And the problem we have with greens is that if you have all the same hue and all the same intensity, it just gets very boring. Now that's often actually what happens in the summertime, which is why I don't like painting in the summer. I like a lot of variety, but even if your subject is very boring in terms of the color, you should make your painting more colorful. So how do we go about doing that? Well, over here we have all the greens, and even just, so this is a little more interesting. Say I introduce some of the cadmium yellow light and some of this cinnabar green. You know, that's a little more interesting, but it's still a pretty boring combination. The secret to exciting greens is this side of the color palette over here. And so I'm just going to show you one of the first things that I like to do and that you might not think of is I'm going to take my my phthalo green blue shade, and I'm going to mix some red with it. Now that's still a green. Let's maybe put a little bit more white in there so that you can actually see the color. But now we've dramatically changed the hue. We've also dramatically changed the intensity. These are fairly bright greens. This is a really dull green because green and red are complements. Now if we mix a pure green with a pure red, we'll get a gray. And we're actually getting close to that. Actually, if I throw a little bit more of a cool red in there, which is our magenta, we'll almost get a pure gray. Now, I don't really want that in this painting. So what I want to do when I mix a green, if I make it, let's go more into the orange, and I'll let the orange dominate, and then a little more of the green. Now we've got these really beautiful kind of olive toned greens. And this also allows us to transition. In my photo, we go from green to these kind of olivey greens to oranges and to yellows. And now we've got that transition actually taking place right here, all on my palette. So I can actually just go into the various aspects of from a very dull neutral, almost a grayish green, into an olive, into a little more orangey, into a little more yellowy. And I'll do this with all of my various greens there, sometimes mixing orange with them, sometimes mixing yellows with them. And sometimes letting that red actually dominate, so it's a orange or a red with just a slight kind of green cast to it. And you can see already this is much more interesting than that. Well, when we also go the other way and add a little bit of blue in here, so now we're changing the hue of that phthalo green blue shade till it's almost pure blue. Now we've got even more color, and let's add some purple in there. And one thing I love is mixing phthalo green blue with the purple, and it gives us almost a bluish gray. And I like using these colors coming in. I'm going to block in my shadows first of all kind of with the dark olive green mixture, but then I'll come back in here with these purplish mixtures. And let's add a little magenta in here as well. And so generally I just want to have a whole pile of colorful mixtures of greens, but then I'll actually start looking at my reference photo and making sure I have specific greens that are in there. So again, the idea of mixing your greens with oranges and with yellows, there's as opposed to that awful, I'd say awful, kind of just white added to a phthalo green. So these are still all fairly medium values to dark values. We haven't got into any of the really bright, intense greens yet. So let's take our cadmium green light and let's add a little cadmium yellow light to it. Now, whenever I do that, I also want to make that same mixture with my cadmium yellow medium, because that's going to give me just a slightly warmer green. And we also want this mix to, so let's go, because we do have some pure yellows in here. So let's mix it into the pure yellow, into the lemon yellow. And then let's start coming back around the other way into the oranges, because we do have some very bright, intense, pure oranges in here. And so you can see in here now, I've got an extremely colorful variation of greens, of yellowy greens, of orangey greens, of kind of grayish greens, of heading up into here in these light kind of olive tone greens. I just have so much more color choices to choose from than if I just take my one green and mix white to it, or even taking a green and just mixing yellows with it. You get very slight variations in color. But I will also do a lot of mixing on my palette with the brush so that you pick up various bits of each color, and that just makes such a huge difference. Again, especially when you have a painting where it's green dominant. And even if the colors in your subject are kind of boring, what you ideally want to do is check, even within a green that looks all the same. This kind of sage green is what you see all summer long, which is again why I don't paint in the summer. But even if you're doing that, you can have variations within that by adding more reds, more oranges, or more magentas, or more purples or blues. And if you start with an extremely colorful palette of greens, there's a much better chance you're going to finish with a very colorful painting with greens in it. If you start with a very boring palette of basically one hue with just value changes, or even just 2 or 3 different hues with value changes, then you're going to end up with a very boring palette. You also run the risk of the painting kind of lacking unity because of the fact that these reds, yellows, oranges are mixed in with the greens. When I put these next to the reds, yellows, and oranges that are going to be in the painting, they're going to relate to each other because there's elements of one color in the other. So yeah, that's my take on mixing greens. Basically, the more colors you can kind of mix into them, the better. So that's, what are we at now? 11 minutes. That's probably good for today. Tomorrow's video, well, we have Brooke coming in the studio later today, so tomorrow's video might be Brooke with our mentorship program. But then I will get to the actual starting of the painting and how, once I've got this all out, what is my thought process and what I'm going to do first and how I'm going to attack this little painting. Oh, one other thing I should probably mention, because this is a tiny painting, it's not going to eat up a lot of paint. But I probably got, I don't know, $15 or $20 worth of paint out here. And this paint will be good if I use my Stay Wet palette, probably for 3 or 4 days. So what I like to do when I'm working on small paintings is do several in a row and try and do subject matter where I can use the same or similar colors. So I might even be able to work off the same palette for the next painting, or I might be able to scrape a lot of this paint off and move on. But I wouldn't want to squeeze out all this color to do a painting like this and then move to a small winter scene where I'm going to squeeze out all kinds of paints that are mainly going to be in the blues. So although I don't know specifically what painting I'm going to do next, but I know it will be something, probably the next 2 paintings, where I can use these paints, because you know, art materials are expensive and I don't like flushing them down the garbage. So if you found this helpful, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe, tell your friends. I welcome your questions and comments. I'm Tim Packer. Oh, one last thing. I'll just show you a close-up. Let me get this in here in case you couldn't see it very well. Okay, I will see you tomorrow.